Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into a video by the Great War Channel. This obviously is Indy Naval, somebody that we're familiar with through the Sabaton history videos. And we're going to do top 10 misconceptions about World War One. I am curious as to what these are. I think they have one. If it's not them, it's a different video, but I think I've seen one also about World War Two. So I'm going to look for that one later, but we're going to do this one today. So let's get into it. Top 10 misconceptions about World War One.
There's been a lot more coverage of the Second World War than the First, as most of you are no doubt aware. And we've noticed that probably because of that lack of coverage, people have a lot of misconceptions about the First World War, how and where it happened, and who was fighting it. And we're going to try to fix that today. I'm Indy Naval. Welcome to a Great War special episode, the top 10 popular misconceptions about the war. Number 10, Russia was only a second-grade military power in the First World War. Not true. Russia may have left the war after the revolution, and certainly the Great Retreat and disasters like the Battle of Tannenberg don't exactly make the Russian military record shine. But the Russian army was anything but a pushover. At this time, 100 years ago, they were just romping through eastern Anatolia, and the Brusilov offensive and the innovative tactics it used came seriously close to knocking Austria out of the war, or even collapsing the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. It certainly broke the back of their army. The enormous growth and modernization of the Russian military industry by 1916 was also nothing to sneeze at. Number 9. Everything has already been said about the war.
So the Brusilov offensive was probably the most successful Russian offensive. So I don't know if the best thing that they did is one to point at and say the army as a whole is actually this. Just like the worst showing it wouldn't be fair to point at the Russian army's worst showing on the Eastern Front and be like, see, that's what the army is. The Russian army it's in a very weird spot, right? Because the empire is sort of falling apart, much like a lot of the empires of Europe at that time. They have, in theory, a ton of men, a ton of resources, a ton of everything, basically. But their logistics aren't great. Their leadership is poor in particular spots. And of course, their leadership at the top is pretty poor, right? I would say the Russian army is sort of like a lot of the other armies of World War One. They are ground down, have a hard time, keeping up with supplies, materials, and morale. I don't know. I wouldn't say that they're substantially worse than every other power. They could have beaten the brakes off of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If it was just the Austro-Hungarians on the Eastern Front, Russia would have wiped them out, right? So they're not the worst military fighting, but it's in comparison to the other major powers. So it's in comparison to Britain, France, Germany. I don't know. What do y'all think about that one? I'm curious.
No. New stuff is being discovered all the time.
Time out. Let me go back a little bit.
Number 9, everything has already been said about the war. No, new stuff is being discovered all the time, like that Edith Cavell actually was spying for Britain, or that Falkenhayn's claim that the Battle of Verdun was to bleed France to death is quite likely an invention after the fact. Files are being declassified even now, 100 years after the war. Who knows what we're going to find out? Number 8, the Germans were the bad guys in the war. Really? Since they were the...
I've talked about this one probably 100 times on this channel. The Germans get a bad rap for World War One. I think it's a mix of Allied propaganda and historical context. Like, we look back and view World War One Germany through the lens of what we know World War Two Germany does. And I think it taints the way we see World War One Germany. But yeah, this is a common misconception.
The bad guys in World War II, and wartime stories of the bloodthirsty Huns circulated in Allied media, they had to be the bad guys, right? And they got all the blame at Versailles in 1919. That has to count for something. Well, not so much. Was it Germany's fault that the whole house of cards came crashing down? That the war escalated into the horror that it did? Not so much more than anybody else in Europe, who all had outdated ideas about the necessity of the war and how to pursue it. And sure, you do have episodes like the Rape of Belgium, but atrocities were committed by all sides. The Armenian genocide and the massacres committed by the Russians in East Prussia in 1914 spring to mind. Just because somebody is the enemy doesn't mean that they're the bad guy. Sometimes there is no bad guy. Sometimes everyone is the bad guy. Number 7, the war in the skies was a gentleman's war. The Flying Aces, like the Red Baron and Billy Bishop, they were the rock stars of the war, gliding above the carnage and fighting man to man chivalrously, except, again, not so much. They were fighting with machine guns, and they were most often flying in formations by the second half of the war, when the average life expectancy of the pilots could be measured in hours. And never forget, the perfect kill happened when the enemy never saw you coming. Number 6, World War I was a European war, and not a world war. Not true. It had its origins in Europe, and there was certainly a lot of the fighting done in Europe, but once the Ottoman Empire joined, you should have a clue how it would spread. Even before that, Japan fought against Germany. The United States and Brazil would eventually join the war. There were battles in the South Pacific and the South Atlantic. Soldiers from every continent, except Antarctica, would fight. And of course, there was fighting all over Africa, mainly by colonial overlords, but there were fronts in Persia, Mesopotamia, Libya, and even the borders of India. Definitely a world war here.
Yeah, that one, honestly, that one's probably because of just who the major belligerents are and what the more well-known areas of fighting of the war are. Like, it's, the areas where fighting is most centered on the Eastern and Western Front, I think give the idea or perception that, like, that is the war. In its entirety, that's the war. But yeah, it's obviously it's everywhere. He said it. Once the Ottoman Empire joins, I mean, it's the spread outside of Europe is completely inevitable. And that's kind of the reason why Germany is pushing the Ottomans to join, right? They want this kind of spread of fighting. They want the British to be peeled away, right? That's kind of the idea of it. So, yeah.
Number 5, the war was only fought in the trenches. The trenches are the symbol of World War I, and while they appeared on pretty much every front, the vast trench networks were only really common on the Western Front. In the deserts or the huge open spaces of the Eastern Front, cavalry played a bigger role, and huge trench systems would have been most often impossible to maintain. Number 4, tactics during the war didn't change. It's easy to think that, looking at the week-by-week carnage, how we cover it, but...
Yeah, and okay, so I've talked about this before too. There are British historians that are so, I mean, you can feel their hatred coming through the page, writing about the British High Command and their unwillingness to change tactics, right? But the deal is that all of this stuff is new. So unless you kind of just throw guys out there and try stuff, how do you ever learn? But there is learning that is taking place. I talk about this. By the end of the war, Germany has this huge defense in depth strategy where it's like a rubber band that you hit more and more resistance as you go further and further back. The tactics aren't the same. You have things like creeping barrages that come into effect. Obviously, gas comes and plays a role. That even things like what the soldiers wear, how they march, from the beginning of the war is totally different by the end of the war. So everything changes during the war.
But if you look at tactics in 1914 and those in 1918, it would be difficult to find many real similarities. The stalemate across the various fronts pretty much forced tactical innovation. Heck, the war saw the advent of mechanized mobile warfare, and certainly the techniques Hitler's Wehrmacht used at the beginning of World War II grew directly out of those used at the end of World War I. Number 3, navies did not play a real part in World War I. Well, the biggest battle in naval history, the Battle of Jutland, happened in World War I. Britain's Atlantic blockade of Germany was a big factor.
That was a huge factor. The blockade of Germany was the thing that forces Germany's hand later in the war. They're always running against a ticking clock. Even before there's the threat of the Americans coming, because they know that the blockade is going to strangle them. And so the blockade plays a huge role in the war.
In depriving Germany of supplies. There were countless naval skirmishes all over the war. Germany tried to turn the tide of war with unrestricted U-boat warfare. And if you look at the Mediterranean, the major powers there were using their navies to block each other. There were also great stories of German raiders like the Merv or the Emden, which you should definitely check out there. Number 2, the German army wasn't defeated in World War I. Yes, they were. They endured far longer than anyone could have imagined, and their final offensives in 1918 were real forces to be reckoned with. But the state of the army by the summer of 1918 was catastrophic in terms of supplies and morale. And the state of their allies was worse. Austria-Hungary never really recovered after 1916. The Ottoman Empire had huge problems even before the war. And
yeah, the quote that the Germans had at the time was that they were fettered to a corpse, right? They were tied to a dead guy. Because, yeah, their allies were... The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is literally on its deathbed at this point. And so Germany is more or less fighting alone. Again, the British have had their blockade. The domestic situation at home is not good. I think this comes from the internal domestic propaganda of the Germans that the Germans were doing well all the way to the end. I think that might be where this kind of stems from.
And the Bulgarian army collapsed. And the German army did call for a ceasefire before the Allies broke through the Hindenburg Line, which they would have done. Number 1, World War I was mainly fought on the Western Front. There was the Eastern Front, the Serbian Front, the Italian Front, the Salonika Front, Gallipoli, the Persian Front, the Mesopotamian Front, the Palestine Front, the Libyan Front, the Caucasus Front, the Romanian Front. East Africa, Southwest Africa, Cameroon, the war at sea, the Arab Revolt. Did I miss anything? The Western Front was but a fraction, and not even a big fraction, of the total of the First World War. Okay, well, that is my list for now. Now, no doubt you have many things you disagree with or many others you'd like to add to the list. Please let us know in the comments. And for anyone new to our channel, you can find over 200 videos about World War I on our channel. But if you're a bit overwhelmed with the selection, you can check out our 101 video right here.
Okay, so that was top 10 misconceptions about World War I. I don't know if I outright disagree with any of them. The Russian army one, I'm not entirely sure on, because it depends on how you gauge a military and at what time of the war you're talking about. But other than that, and I don't even think I outright disagree with that one. But anyway, I'm curious what you all think about this. Agree, disagree. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will put the link to the Discord down below, and I will see you all next time.